So take a few more minutes to check your motivation, and you can remember and regenerate the motivation you started your day with today, or generate something new, but still along the same lines of altruism, wanting to benefit others, not harm others, wanting to reach the highest goal, state of enlightenment, Buddhahood, to be able to benefit others in the best possible way. And then think that is your reason, your motivation for being here tonight. Okay, so we have been looking at this topic of the mind, primary minds or main minds, and mental factors. So we finished looking at the virtuous mental factors, 11 of those. We also, before that, we looked at the 5 ever-present and the 5 object ascertaining mental factors. And then last week we started looking at the afflictive ones, especially the root afflictions, 6 root afflictions. And we started looking at attachment, the first of the 6, and we didn't quite finish that, so I'll carry on with that tonight. But I just got an email from Venerable Damcha with a very interesting question. She said that she and Venerable Amsel were wondering how virtue and wrong consciousness compare. And she gives this example of a wrong consciousness perceiving a dog's tooth to be a Buddha relic. You know that story? So that's a wrong consciousness. But would there be the virtuous mental factor of faith arising together with this wrong consciousness? Yeah? So I've never heard this discussed before, so I don't know for sure, but I thought we could just discuss it and come up with some possible answers. I also wrote to Venerable Children to ask if she's heard anything about this. But it does seem that this example that she gives would be a case of a wrong consciousness that is also accompanied by a virtuous mental factor. And so a wrong consciousness would always have some mental factors together with it. Every consciousness has mental factors, at least the 5 ever-present ones, feeling and so forth. And it could also have afflictive mental factors, attachment, aversion, and so forth. But it does seem like it could also have the mental factor of faith. I was thinking of another example, because we started looking at the afflictions last week, and I've heard it said that the afflictions are all wrong consciousnesses. And I was looking for a source for this. I couldn't find one until I looked at this little book of that M brought back from Geshe-ma's course. It's called What is the Mind? So this is Geshe-ma Kelsang Wangmo, gave a course at Tushita about the mind and mental factors. And in here, she talks about correct consciousnesses and wrong consciousness. And wrong consciousness would be an object, a consciousness whose object of engagement doesn't exist. And she said, like, for example, the classic examples of seeing rabbit's horns, looking at a rabbit, seeing the ears sticking up and thinking they're horns, or seeing two moons because of some fault in your eye, or you took something, some substance. So, and then another one is thinking like a conceptual thought, conceptual mind that thinks sound is impermanent. Sound is permanent. In fact, it's impermanent, but if you think it's permanent, or any object that's impermanent, like our body, thinking our body is permanent. So that would be another example of a wrong consciousness. And then she says, all afflictions, such as ignorance, anger, attachment, and so forth, are wrong consciousnesses because their objects of engagement are non-existent. And afflictions, all the afflictions. So I guess that means the root afflictions as well as the secondary ones. And I have heard that before, that all the afflictions or delusions, afflictive emotions are wrong consciousnesses. They're seeing things incorrectly. And then she goes on to give examples of these, like ignorance. Ignorance, for example, there's different kinds of ignorance, but one kind of ignorance is believing the I to be inherently existing when in fact it's not. There's no such thing as an inherently existing I. So grasping at an inherently existing I, that is something that doesn't exist. So it's a wrong consciousness. And then attachment, if there's some object, whether it's a person or some material object that we find attractive, attachment exaggerates the attractive aspects of the object and maybe superimposes, projects things that aren't even there. So it makes it much more wonderful and fantastic than it really is. So there's this exaggerated object, wonderful, fantastic object, and then being attached to that. So it's also a wrong consciousness. And then with anger, it's the opposite. There's some person or some object that we dislike, and the mind will exaggerate the bad qualities, the unpleasant qualities, the negative qualities of that object, and then believe in that, believe the person or object it really is horrible and bad and 100% everything bad, and believe in that and grasp at that. So that, again, it's a wrong consciousness. Does that make sense? That afflictive emotions are wrong consciousnesses. But then, as we looked last time, not all the afflictions are non-virtuous. His Holiness, in Volume 3, was a quotation from him where he said, not all the afflictions are non-virtuous. So ignorance and view of a personal identity, or view of a transitory collection, and view of extremes, those three are neutral. They're not non-virtuous by themselves. So then I was thinking, if ignorance, like ignorance believing in inherently existing I, or believing in inherently existing other objects, so if that is in the mind, there could also be something virtuous as well. Like believing in an inherently existing I, and I want to be happy. I want to have a good rebirth in my next life. I want to be born in the God realm, or be born in the form realm or the formless realm. So what do I have to do? Oh, I have to create virtue. I have to develop calm abiding. So you engage in doing virtuous activities with a virtuous mental factor, but at the same time, ignorance. Having this ignorance, believing in inherent existence. What do you think? Sippa, you look doubtful.
I heard Geshe Tashi Tsering mention something similar to this, suggesting that love and attachment could be in the same mind, accompany the same mind. He didn't elaborate on it, and I can't say for sure whether that was his idea or I don't remember him saying he had seen that anywhere in any text. But it seems like the problem you would have is that, the mental factors have to share the 5 similarities with the main mind, and it seems like even if each mental factor wouldn't they share the same aspect with each other as well? Like if you have a mental consciousness that's focusing on a dog's tooth and it's erroneously engaging that object, it's then the mental factor of faith, because it's, I don't know how it would also relate to the dog's tooth if it's somehow thinking that it's not a dog's tooth,
Yeah, so this person thought it was a Buddha's relic. Yeah. Relic of the Buddha and not a dog. I mean, that's what she was told by her son, I think. And she didn't know any better, so she thought, oh, it's a relic of the Buddha, a tooth of the Buddha. And I guess she totally believed in that and had so much faith to it and put it on her altar and was praying to it, right? Isn't that the story? Yeah, and it had beneficial results. So it does seem like faith was present at the same time as this wrong consciousness, believing in something that didn't really exist.
Is it necessarily the case that a wrong consciousness is non-virtuous? For example, I mean,
no.
so
well, that's part of the question here.
So then, if it's not the case, then like even an I consciousness apprehending 2 moons is a wrong consciousness, but doesn't necessarily a non-virtuous mind.
Yeah, I don't think wrong and non-virtuous are mutually
equivalent,
inclusive.
Right?
No.
Yeah. So then if that's so, then it seems to me that a virtuous mind could easily arise.
Yeah.
And be okay with it.
Yeah, because they talk about contaminated karma, contaminated virtue, contaminated good karma. That's when we create good karma, virtue, but our mind is under the influence of ignorance, grasping at inherent existence. So it becomes the cause of happiness within samsara, good rebirths, good experiences within samsara, but isn't able to get us out of samsara. So it's virtue, but it's contaminated. And contaminated by what? Contaminated by ignorance. So it does seem that if it is possible, I'm guessing, ignorance can be in the mind together at the same time with a virtuous state of mind.
Yeah. It would be like giving with a negative motivation. The giving is still a virtue, but it's tainted by the negative motivation. Like giving out of attachment to getting one's name on a plaque.
Well, that's a different thing. Because there you do have something non-virtuous. If there's attachment in the mind, I want something for myself, that's non-virtuous. But what I'm saying is that there could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be anything non-virtuous. There could be afflictions, but afflictions that are not non-virtuous, like the neutral afflictions. But then, if this is the case, let's say, my example of being under the influence of ignorance. Ignorance is there in the mind, believing in inherent existence. But there's also virtue, like faith in the 3 jewels, faith in your teacher, conscientiousness about keeping your vows and precepts and so on. So there's virtuous mental factors together with ignorance. But what they say is if there's a virtuous mental factor in the mind, then it colors the whole mind. The main mind and all the other mental factors also become virtuous. So if ignorance is there at the same time, then it becomes virtuous. Virtuous ignorance. It would have to, according to the explanation. So that sounds a little strange, maybe. What do you think? Virtuous ignorance. Virtuous confusion. Well, why not?
We're under the power of confusion about the nature of reality, and that's always an aspect of our mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's why they say that all our virtue is contaminated. And
So even taking vows, keeping vows, doing all the prayers that we do, and so on and so forth, as long as we're still caught up in grasping at inherent existence, then it's virtue, but contaminated or polluted virtue.
I just remember Venerable talked about this recently. Venerable talked about the thing about the ignorance that the afflicted. I mean, maybe it was you too. The afflicted ignorance is the ignorance that doesn't understand the nature of karma and so forth and so forth. But the deeper ignorance of the nature of reality itself is not non-virtuous.
Yeah, that was from His Holiness's book. It was in that earlier.
Yeah.
Somewhere. I can't find it now, but yeah, he did make a
But he
distinction.
really made a very clear distinction there between those two types of ignorance.
Yeah. Somewhere in there. Anyway, so that's...
I did 2 questions online.
Oh.
Yeah, we're online.
It's page 137.
Huh.
And from 7 to 139 is what you referred to last week.
Line 3.
No, line 3, what was 137 to 139? The natural virtue.
Yeah, those 5 types of virtue, 5 types of non-virtue. But then somewhere else in here, I think it was actually page 110, it's where he talks about how not all the afflictions are non-virtuous by nature, and then gives some different examples.
First question was, what is the karma of the son who deceived his mother even though there were beneficial results?
Well, you have to ask Buddha about that. I don't know. We can never know exactly. I mean, he did have a good motivation, right? His motivation was good, I think. So maybe there's a mixture in there. Yeah. Lying, deceiving, but wanting to benefit her, but maybe also wanting her to not be angry to him for not bringing back a relic of the Buddha. Yeah, probably a mixture of different things. So yeah, only Buddha would know exactly what karma he created and what results he had. But it had a good ending. I mean, she had all this faith in this dog's tooth, and it was beneficial for her. He never actually told her the truth, right? Yeah. So he left her there.
Well, the story doesn't say if he was a bodhisattva or not.
Yeah.
And the other question was, if the higher realm beings, such as those in the God realm, do not accrue as much bad karma because their afflictions are subdued, can they still do great harm, for instance, out of attachment?
Beings, I guess he means, the person means in the form and formless realms, can they do great harm?
Out of attachment, I guess. Because I guess last week you talked about them not having anger.
Yeah.
Right?
I wouldn't think so. Beings in the form realm and the formless realm, their minds are very subdued. And there's also something in the Abhidharma Kosha they talk about, I'd never heard this before, concentration vows. Have you ever heard of those? Concentration vows. Yeah, they're naturally arising. When your mind is in a state of concentration, samadhi, then you have concentration vows, which It's not like vows that you take, that you promise, but because your mind is in that state of samadhi, you just naturally don't do any of the 10 non-virtues. So something like that. But of course, they're not always in samadhi. There's times when they come out. But I guess even when they're out, they behave pretty well. They don't do... I think the 10 non-virtues don't exist in the form realm. And of course, the formless realm. They don't do any of those 10 non-virtues. So if they don't do those non-virtues, they probably... Yeah, I think the only danger maybe with attachment is they get attached to their meditative state, the samadhi, and that can cause it to degenerate. And they also can get arrogant, how great I am because I've achieved this samadhi. And so they can have kind of low-level afflictions, but certainly not like we have in this world. Yeah. So they probably don't do anything really severe and serious and harmful.
Thank you. So the concentration vows was in the four Indonesian texts, and I couldn't figure out what it meant. So now
It's in the Abhidharma Kosha. I can give you some information about that. I was going to say something else. But but they do say that after being in the form realm or the formless realm, and your karma runs out, your karma to be there runs out, then even if you haven't created any heavy negative karma during those lifetimes, you still have karma from past lives, karmic seeds that hadn't been purified. So it's possible that they could come up at the time of death and cause a unfortunate rebirth. So, shall we move on? Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure about this question, but this is a guess. But I think definitely it would not be possible to have a virtuous mental factor and a non-virtuous mental factor together at the same time, in the same mind. That wouldn't be possible. So you couldn't have anger and faith, or attachment and faith. I mean, that example of... But maybe it wasn't...
You can't have two opposing mental factors like love and hatred at the same time. They
That's...
say you can't have...
But how could that work? Because they say if you have a virtuous mental factor, the whole mind and other mental factors become virtuous, and the same with non-virtuous. So, so maybe what Geshe-la said, I mean, it'll come more clear because His Holiness is also talking about different kinds of attachment, and sometimes the word attachment is used for something that's more like affection, not necessarily the really negative kind of attachment, but more affection. So let's continue. Where we left off, there's a paragraph that starts with, similarly, there are different ways to be attached to a beautiful statue of the Buddha. Find that in the file that I sent last week.
2 paragraphs about anger.
Yeah.
Another verse that we cling to this life.
Yeah, it's towards the end of the section on attachment before anger. But the beginning of the paragraph, I think this is the beginning of the paragraph. It says, similarly, there are different ways to be attached to a beautiful statue of the Buddha. One person wants a beautiful statue to inspire his daily meditation practice. Another person wants the same statue to show off to his friends or sell for a profit. These different motivations will bring different results in the present life and in future lives. So, wanting a beautiful statue of the Buddha to inspire your daily meditation practice, is that really attachment?
Read the question again.
He's giving the example of, like this statue, let's say. If you want to own such a statue for your practice, your meditation practice, if you think, oh, if I have that statue on my altar in front of me when I'm meditating, it will be very beneficial for my practice. It will help my practice very much. So do you think that's really attachment?
Aspiration in the sense of wanting to achieve higher concentration states rather than attachment.
I would think it's not attachment because it doesn't have the exaggeration that in the way we're using the word, the definition we have. It's not exaggerating the good qualities of it.
I guess it could be both. I was thinking about one example when the Tibetans had to leave Tibet. And I read one Lama who created, shortly before he left Tibet, a wonderful altar in Lhasa in his apartment. And some Tibetans indeed, the Lama say, did not leave Tibet because of attachment. And, you know, if you have a nice house or an altar, beautiful statues, so yeah, then for sure. But if you more see the value behind the statues and the altar more for an inner purpose, to develop inner qualities, then...
I was thinking that your mind could switch because, you know, every moment our mind has different thoughts, different feelings, different experiences. So there could be moments where you just have pure faith, pure devotion, pure inspiration to practice, and there's no attachment at all to the statue. But there, you know, at another moment, you know, you might look at that statue and think, wow, what a beautiful statue. I'm so happy I have this statue, and, you know, kind of clinging to it, not wanting to separate from it. If somebody comes along and says, oh, wow, what a nice statue. Would you give it to me? You might say, no way. So I think there could be at different moments, different, because I have a very nice tanka of the Buddha that was given to me by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I like it very much because I think it's very, very beautiful. And it's also special because it was given to me by a special person, one of my teachers. So if I think about how I would feel if something happened to it, if it was stolen or lost or burned in a fire, I would be pretty sad. And I don't think it's so much because of, oh, now I don't have that object anymore to help me in my meditation, but more the, you know, sentimental. Sentimental. Yeah. So I don't know, that's my thought when I thought about this question. It was, you know, at different moments, at different times, there could be different things going on in our mind. Sometimes attachment, sometimes not. And then he goes on to say, in short, attachment may have diverse meanings in different contexts. This is illustrated by the 4 types of clinging mentioned in the teaching, parting from the 4 attachments that Manjushri gave to the great Sakya Lama, Sachen Kunga Nyingpo. If you cling to this life, you are not a true spiritual practitioner. If you cling to samsara, you do not have renunciation. If you cling to your own self-interest, you have no bodhicitta. If there is grasping, you do not have the view. So it says the first line indicates clinging to the happiness of this life. 8 worldly dharmas, which is invariably an obstacle for dharma practice. The presence or absence of this type of attachment is the demarcation between an action that is dharma and one that is not. So that kind of attachment interferes with our dharma practice and can pollute our dharma practice, so that it's, you know, if we're studying or meditating or teaching or working for others, but mixed with that is some attachment to praise, to reputation, to gain, and so forth, then it's not pure dharma. And it could lead to suffering, it could lead to non-virtue. The second, clinging to cyclic existence, prevents us from embarking on the path to liberation, although it could lead to happiness within samsara, as exemplified by the person who is attached to the bliss of samadhi and is born in the form or formless realms. So he seems to be saying that the attachment to samsara doesn't necessarily bring suffering. It could bring happiness if one wishes to have a good rebirth, especially in these higher realms, former formless realms, and then develops calm abiding, samadhi, the concentrations that enable you to be born in those realms. So then it becomes virtue. That attachment motivates the practice of virtue. The third one, clinging to our self-interest prevents us from entering the bodhisattva path, although it could support the attainment of arhatship. For example, by a person who craves to be free of samsara and seeks his own liberation alone. So again, that type of clinging to me, my own happiness, isn't necessarily a bad thing, a negative thing, because it could motivate one to develop renunciation and then practice the 3 higher trainings and attain liberation. So again, it could be a stimulus for virtue and even the attainment of nirvana, liberation. The most deeply ingrained attachment is grasping inherent existence, which prevents the attainment of both liberation and full awakening. He doesn't have a but here, but again, I think it could be the basis for practicing virtue, creating virtue in order to have good rebirths. So believing there's a real inherently existing I, and we hear about the lower realms, and we feel, I don't want to go there. I want a good place. I want a good rebirth in God realm, or at least a human realm. And so then that would lie behind our practice of virtue, practicing the 10 virtues to create the causes for good rebirths. And it could also be behind somebody following the path to nirvana. That wouldn't work. Because according to Chandrakirti, to attain nirvana, you have to overcome ignorance, grasping an inherent existence. But according to the lower schools, you can get out of samsara without overcoming that ignorance. But anyway, it seems like he's saying that attachment is complex. It could be non-virtuous. For example, we have strong attachment to wealth, possessions, and so on. Then we might engage in non-virtue, like lying, stealing, extortion, even murder. So then it definitely becomes non-virtuous. But it could also be neutral. For example, attachment in the upper realms is said to be neutral. And it looks like it could even be virtuous, if we're not wrong about that. If it's... no, actually, not sure about that. If it accompanies faith or conscientiousness. No, it could be. If we have attachment to birth in a form realm or formless realm, and to achieve such a rebirth, we engage in the practice of calm abiding, samadhi. So it motivates us to create virtue, the causes for such rebirths. But then again, would that be attachment or aspiration? Because earlier he was making this distinction between attachment and aspiration, and using the word aspiration for good rebirths, good samsaric rebirths rather than attachment. So, hard to say. I don't know. I find this section a little, I don't know, I don't want to say confusing, but he seems to bring up a lot of different points, and maybe it's just to stimulate our thoughts. Huh?
All over the place.
Yeah. But, you have a but.
Is it possible for a root affliction to be anything but non-virtuous? Besides those three?
Well, ignorance is one of the root afflictions. It's one of the
But those two,
poisons.
is
I mean,
it is
attachment and anger.
yeah, but it's not the root ignorance that's the affliction. It's the ignorance of
Ignorance of karma.
cause and effect.
Yeah. No, but it said even ignorance is neutral. By itself, ignorance is neutral.
But not the ignorance of cause and effect. The ignorance of cause and effect is necessarily virtuous. I'm pretty absolutely positive. Non-virtuous, I mean. Yeah, afflicted. I can check my sources.
Yeah, I have it here. He said, anger and hatred can never be the motivating factors for virtue. They always lead to non-virtue. And, oh yeah, he was talking about this verse from Nagarjuna, that verse that says attachment, anger, confusion, and the karma that arises from them are non-virtuous. Okay, so, and then he's explaining that the meaning of attachment in this verse is selfish desire for material possessions and so on and so forth. So that leads to non-virtue. Whereas here now, and then he uses aspiration for the happiness of future lives, which, yeah, maybe it's not even attachment, can lead to virtuous actions. And then he says anger and hatred can never be the motivating factors for virtue. They always lead to non-virtue. And then confusion in this verse, he says confusion here refers not to self-grasping ignorance, that is the root of samsara, but to the ignorance that does not understand karma and effects. Self-grasping ignorance can precede virtuous actions. Okay, so there it is. That's what I was saying before. Self-grasping ignorance can precede virtuous actions. The ignorance that has a skewed view of ethical conduct will lead to non-virtue. Yeah, so he's saying that leads to non-virtue, whereas virtue, ignorance grasping the self as inherently existing, self-grasping ignorance, that isn't necessarily non-virtuous, doesn't lead to non-virtue.
I think I've read in both something that Bhikkhu Bodhi wrote from the Pali Canon about the word attachment or desire, and also, I think we've talked about it before, that I think that it's kind of like one of those situations where there's different usages of the same word. You know, like we have that in a lot of words. And so we're using the same word, but there happens to be the same word.
Yeah.
So it's nice that he switched it to aspiration there, because it makes it clear to us, and we don't have to deal with it being one word used in two situations, one that's virtuous and one that isn't. You know.
But he did have, there was a paragraph in there about, in the Ananda, so from the Pali tradition, Ananda says that based on the craving for liberation, that's like a virtuous kind of craving. Mm-hmm. And then he mentioned this text speaking of virtuous and non-virtuous forms of craving. So the word craving, normally it's a kind of attachment, something problematic, harmful. But it's in this Pali text it mentions it a virtuous kind of craving. Yeah, so it is a little confusing, but I think he's just pointing out, my understanding is he's pointing out that in the different texts from different traditions, you have these terms which, sometimes they refer to something non-virtuous and problematic, but sometimes they're used in a way that's virtuous. Because in the last paragraph here, he talks about another example of this. He says the Tibetan term chakpa may also be translated as attachment and is sometimes used to indicate strong affection and care. In this sense, Buddhas are attached to sentient beings, indicating that due to their strong compassion, they will never abandon sentient beings and will continuously work to lead them to temporal and ultimate happiness. The feeling of closeness and care that Buddhas have for sentient beings is very different from attachment in the minds of sentient beings. So it sounds like the word attachment is sometimes used for the feeling that Buddhas have for us. But that's definitely not non-virtuous, definitely not afflicted even. So it's the same word, but having a totally different meaning.
It seems like if the thing that sorts it out is the motivation. A lot, like the motivation that's involved seems to sort it out when it comes to like an action, like what you're saying about the statue that you own, how that could vary, but what's happening in the mind, our motivations change a lot. So sometimes with regards to the same object, it could change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, motivation is one thing, but I think also understanding, like in the mind of the Buddha, there would never be any wrong consciousness. Mm-hmm. The Buddha is not exaggerating, superimposing onto sentient beings, seeing them as much better than they really are. So there's none of that wrong way of seeing things, which is true for most of the afflictions, if not all of the afflictions. That's what Geshe-ma says. All of the afflictions are wrong consciousnesses. So in the mind of a Buddha, there would never be any wrong consciousness, any distorted way of seeing things. So Buddha would see everything correctly, therefore no afflictions at all. So even if they use words like, attachment or anger, like in the wrathful deities, it's not anger as we normally understand it. It's just a show of force, maybe, but not at all. This distorted way of seeing things. Even if attachment isn't always non-virtuous, it is definitely an affliction. And that means it's something that disturbs the mind, it's something that sees things in a wrong way, in a mistaken way, and is an obstacle if we want to achieve higher states of mind, liberation, enlightenment. So it's definitely something we need to work on reducing and eventually freeing ourselves from, abandoning altogether. So there's lots of different methods for working on attachment, remedies for attachment. So maybe you could share what your favorite, what are your favorite remedies for attachment? Favorite in the sense of what works. Mm-hmm. Not just you like it, but it's effective, it works for you.
Well, I've always liked it's always worked for me if it's as good as I think it is, then the more that I have it, the more that I'm with it, the more that I do it, it should increase my pleasure, my happiness. And I have tested that more than I can tell you. And so that has been usually a preemptive understanding when I start seeing myself holding on to things. The hardest part is when I get into attachments to my ideas and opinions, although I've seen if I continue to push and grasp onto them, it causes not only disruption in my mind, but also causes disruption and unsettledness in other people's mind. So it's taken that to the max, If I do think this is as good as it is, try it and see if that's true.
What I've been working lately with is thinking of the results of my attachment when they are exaggerated. Like I stopped eating sweet, and I still have a desire for it, and I think of how I feel after eating it. So for me, it's the results. And we just had an interaction about the tetliti, if it should be. No, it's true. There's somebody offered tetli and to the sangha, a tea that the sangha likes a lot, and I put it all in Ananda without thinking. She offered, and this is how things. If it's offered to the sangha, it's for the sangha, and then the sangha. Anyway, so and then it went into all different kind of direction, and I was looking at it like at my attachment, and the fact that giving it away, the act of giving is an act of receiving for me. More you give, more you receive. It's like, and so I've been thinking of that. So the results, I would say, that I've been working on.
Before I ordained, I was living in Berlin, and before I really made the decision to ordain, and I was kind of attached to the city because I was born there. And then I made this visualization of imagining the city disintegrating, the impermanence of the city. Disintegrating. So, it gets older and older. Nobody takes care of the buildings and the streets, infrastructure and such. And then I got pretty, disinterested in that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, I heard Thich Nhat Hanh uses that. He says, think of an object of attachment and then imagine how it will look after 5 years, after 10 years, after 50 years. Yeah. So that's really powerful.
In some instances, I try to take it back to thinking about karma and what is the real cause of happiness. Because this object is appearing, whether it's praise or whether it's a tangible object like food, or it's something that's going to bring I think will bring pleasure. In those moments when I can call this to mind, then I think, wait a minute, what's the real cause of happiness? And then try to think about that object, or like with praise it doesn't really bring anything good except a temporary, moment of mental joy. But it doesn't. It's not really the cause of happiness, in terms of the kind of happiness I'm looking for. Like Dharma happiness. So taking it back to the first general characteristic of karma, I find helpful.
Also, depending on the object, because almost every object needs a different antidote, I think. But sometimes, especially sense pleasures, offering things to the Buddha, or people offering them to the Buddha, actually is very helpful for me to let them go.
Let's move on to the next one. Anger. Affliction number 2. So it says, this is a kind of definition of anger. It's a mental factor that, referring to one of 3 objects, agitates the mind by being unable to bear, or through wanting to harm the object or person. So it says 3 objects, but it's actually 9. So 3 times 3 makes 9. So the first set of 3 is he harmed me in the past, he is harming me now, he will harm me in the future. So when a person is causing harm to oneself, either in the present or has done so in the past or will do in the future. Have you ever done that? Have you sort of imagined somebody doing something to you that may never happen at all, but your mind just fantasizes, and then you can get all worked up and angry about that? Yeah? Crazy mind. And then the second set has to do with somebody harming someone else that we care about, a dear friend or relative. Okay, so she harmed my dear friend in the past, or is harming them now, or will harm them in the future. This is another cause of anger. Someone we love, someone dear to us, someone we're attached to, probably. And if that person is harmed by somebody else, then we get angry at that person. That person becomes our enemy. And then the third set is about somebody helping my enemies. Right? So the people I don't like, and I don't think they deserve any help or any good experiences, they deserve to suffer. They don't deserve to be happy. So if somebody's helping one's enemy, either in the past or in the present or in the future, then we can get angry at that person, make that person into an enemy. Has that ever happened to you? Ever felt that way? And it says here, enemy includes people we don't like or disagree with, as well as those who harm us or interfere with our happiness. So do you think this covers all possible instances of getting angry? Huh?
No,
No?
because it only has to do with people. And sometimes you get angry at things that don't have to do with
Machines that don't work or break them.
rose bushes that while you're cutting the lawn that are scratching your legs.
You're angry at suffering itself.
But wouldn't that come under the first one? It's not a person, it's a thing, but it's harming. It's harming me. It's
Oh, I thought
making
that
me.
just referred to people in the first one,
Yeah. Well, what I think is most of the time, most of our anger is towards people or sentient beings. Could be mosquitoes or dogs that are barking and making noise and disturbing your meditation. So, sentient beings. But I think there are times when we get angry at inanimate objects. But I think that might still fit in the first one. We perceive that object as harmful to me, causing suffering to me. No?
I think, when I think of harm, my first view is narrow, a narrow definition of harm. But if I think of the whole situation of anything that impacts me so that an affliction arises, or that I feel any kind of discomfort, if I make it really that broad, then harm works quite well.
Yeah, if you're trying to get to work or trying to get to an appointment and your car won't start and you're trying all these things to get your car started and it doesn't cooperate, you get angry at the car, it's harming because it's interrupting something you want to do or something you need to do. It's kind of harm. I would consider that harm. Different than somebody coming and hitting you with a stick, but it's still harming. Harming what I want to do, what I need to do, something like that.
The situation where you shared last time about this woman who got angry, but the anger encouraged her to be initiative in doing social work or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was not, or maybe, the people haven't been friends or relatives to her, that have been people who are generally harmed.
So they were like strangers. She
Yes.
was unhappy that strangers were being harmed. But I think that could still, this is just an example. If somebody's harming your dear friend or your relative, but I think we could also get angry if maybe innocent people we regard as innocent, like children or elderly people or women or whatever, maybe some, what's the word, kind of underprivileged or vulnerable people They may not be people we actually know, but the fact that they are being harmed, we could get angry at them. We care about them.
She cares about them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's an element of love.
Yeah, I think so, and I think His Holiness agrees with that too. There's compassion there. You feel compassion that these people or these beings are being harmed in an unfair way, in a just way, and it motivates you to do something about it. So I think that would be an example of anger that's together with, maybe not in the same moment. I don't know if we could have anger and compassion at the same moment in the mind, but, maybe one after another. The mind can switch very quickly. But definitely there's compassion there. So it's not like completely non-virtuous, especially if you can avoid acting out the anger in ways that are creating more harm, more suffering, and instead put your energy into positive, constructive activity solutions.
Do you think this list covers self-hatred?
Good point. I hate myself. Why? Because I'm harming myself. I don't know. Yeah, maybe not.
Or not hating yourself or not being mindful.
Mm-hmm. Why do we hate ourselves?
Consequences.
Anger can arise towards an object that we think is interfering with something we're attached to, or we think it interferes with our happiness.
Mm.
And we can think that we have defects that interfere with our happiness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe that's the first triad. Myself is harming me, interfering with my happiness, so I want to get it out of the way, beat it up, change it, get it to cooperate with me.
That sounds right.
Hmm?
It sounds like the internal dialogue.
Hmm. I started reading this. There's this author called Eckhart Tolle. You probably heard of. He's like kind of a new age, and I just started reading one of his books. I think it's called The Power of Now, and he talks about this experience that he had. He'd been really, really, really depressed for a long time, and he woke up one morning, and he had some kind of thoughts, some kind of inner dialogue going on, saying, I hate myself, I can't live with myself anymore, this kind of thing. And then he thought, wait a minute, are there two me's? Yeah? Who is it that hates and who is the hated? And that, I guess, like a koan, it just led him to this kind of altered state of mind. But yeah, that's an interesting question to ask yourself. If you see yourself doing this, indulging in self-hatred, who is hating who? Is there two of me in there? It is helpful. It can at least get you out of that, cycle of thinking, which is so painful and useless. Okay, anyway, then it goes on. Anger functions to disturb our mind. Any doubt about that? As the basis for harming ourselves and others, it involves us in destructive actions and increases suffering in the world. That's pretty clear. Anger is based on distorted attention that exaggerates or projects defects on people and things, and on oneself as well. Because when we're indulging in self-anger, self-hatred, self-criticalness, it's a distorted way of thinking. we're not seeing anything good. We're not looking at good things about ourselves. We're only looking at our faults, our mistakes, our shortcomings, and exaggerating those. Like that's all there is, which isn't true. Our minds create many reasons to validate our anger and gives us a false sense of power in situations where we feel afraid or hurt. So I kind of question the false sense of power. Like that story I told last week, the woman managed to get herself out of a terrible situation because of anger. And another story I heard of a woman who was in a relationship with a man was not treating her nicely and even harming her sometimes. And she would think about running away, but she was afraid. She was afraid that, I don't know what she was afraid of, but anyway, she was too afraid to actually leave this person. And then finally one day, I guess he really did something awful. And that was like the last straw. She got really angry about that and just took off and left. So she said it was useful at that moment. You know, the anger gave her the energy to overcome her fear and get herself out of an unhealthy situation. So I'm just wondering, sometimes, in some cases, there could be cases where anger could be useful. I mean, she didn't do anything harmful. She didn't do anything negative or harmful or destructive. She just protected herself, basically.
I think why she was not living could be. It could be.
She's gone, like. Yeah, sorry.
That living could result way more harm because he will look for her. He will, so for her it was a safety to just statu quo. Statu quo, they say. Status quo.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably.
Self-protection.
Yeah. She took herself far away, other side of the country. So, and probably found safe people she felt safe with.
Is there a woman in the news?
Huh?
I think lately, I saw the headlines, I don't know the details, of a woman who also was in a really terrible relationship, and anger finally made her strike back, and she killed him, and now she's in prison for a very long time. And there has been controversy about, wouldn't this be a reasonable thing? So that's the other result of anger.
Yeah, that's not. Well, there are these places. What are they called? For battered women, homes for battered women, shelters. Yeah, so that's a good thing. It's an alternative to killing. Just get yourself to a safe place, a shelter. Anger has many forms, and several other afflictions are derived from it, including irritation, annoyance, frustration, hatred, rebelliousness, belligerence, resentment, vengeance, spite, cruelty, violence, and jealousy. Lots of different forms of. Yeah. Yeah, I remember once I was teaching a course and talking about anger at one point, and one of the women came to see me privately, and she said, when she heard me talking about anger, she thought, oh, I don't need to listen to this. I don't have anger. And then thinking about it more, she realized she did, but she was calling it something else. She was calling it being upset. She would get upset at her mother, and she would get upset at her sister, and get upset about this, and get upset. But she didn't call it anger, which is interesting, yeah? So we might have different names, more polite, perhaps, more mild names. What's wrong?
Well, I'm sorry, but I always thought there had to be this wish to harm for it to be anger.
Yeah, that's full-blown.
And that could be a real spectrum, too.
Yeah.
That's what the definition is helpful.
Yeah. When I was doing the master's program, one of the things we were required to do was to write down anger incidents. And if we got more than a certain number, I think it was 20 in a month, then, we'd be, we wouldn't be like immediately chucked out, but, we'd be talked to. Yeah. Well, it makes sense because, many of the people who do the master's program go on to become teachers. And Rinpoche really wanted to make sure teachers know how to manage their anger because there's been some incidents of that. So, but the way it was defined there was harmfulness, not just irritation or annoyance or impatience, but actually getting to the point of wanting to do something harmful.
Yeah, and even withdrawing affection can be extremely harmful. The intention could be, I'm going to harm you, I'm going to
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But it could also be, I just want to get far away from you so I don't harm you. So it could be non-harmfulness. I want to make sure I don't, hit you or yell at you. Yeah, so you have to check what's really the motivation again. What is your motivation for distancing yourself? It could be wanting to hurt the person. It could also be wanting to not hurt the person if you're in danger of that. Behind each episode of anger are many stories, conceptualizations proliferated by our minds, in which we impute motivations to people that they do not have, interpret actions from our own standpoint, and favor our own concerns while ignoring or demeaning the concerns of others. So our mind may make up all these kind of stories when we don't really know what the other person thinks or what their motivation was, but we can just fantasize that and then get really worked up, angry, based on our stories, which might be completely wrong. Although we may try to justify, rationalize, or deny our anger, the truth is that we are unhappy when our minds are overcome by anger. It makes our mind unhappy. Sometimes we vent our anger to friends, hoping that they will take our side. If they didn't, how could they be our friends? Other times we speak or act in ways that harm others. Here we can see the relationship of attachment and anger. The more distorted attention has exaggerated someone's good qualities, increasing the strength of our attachment, the more distorted attention exaggerates that person's bad qualities when he or she doesn't meet our expectations. So your dearest friend can turn into your worst enemy. If they don't do what you want them to do, or they do what you don't want them to do, they do something hurtful, whatever. So, in a very short time, a dear friend can turn into a hated enemy. We become discontent, and this mental unhappiness inflames our anger, resulting in aggressive behavior that breaks the trust of the people we care about the most. Anger is a mental state, it is not the behavior. While some of us, this is me, some of us may not think of ourselves as angry because we don't throw things or scream at others, inside our anger rages. Now this is something I learned at some point, that I do have anger inside. I'm just not showing it or expressing it. So that was a really useful realization for me. Because if you think you don't have anger, if you're denying it, suppressing it, just because you're not screaming and shouting and acting it out like that, then it doesn't go away. It's still there. So acknowledging it, owning it, is a really important step to take to work on it. In these cases, ignoring the other person or refusing to have anything to do with them may be considered harmful behavior. So may be harmful, but may not. Depends on your motivation. But yeah, definitely if you are angry at somebody and being cold, like this expression in English, cold shoulder, or pouting, that's more what little kids do, but I think adults do it too, right? Pouting. I'm just not going to look at you. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to act as if you don't exist. I'm going to show you. You hurt me. So, yeah, that is or at least it can be, a kind of harmfulness. I want you to suffer, just like you made me suffer. But then if they don't suffer, then it's really irritating. If they act like they don't care. They don't care if you're not paying attention, if they're not, oh, that hurts. Yeah. This is what they call passive aggressiveness, isn't it? Is that the term? Passive aggression. Passive aggression. We should not be fooled thinking that passive behavior, like withdrawing from a situation and refusing to communicate, indicates a lack of anger. Yeah. So we have to look inside and be honest with ourselves if there is anger, if there is the wish to harm or not. Anger may also be a reaction to fear. When fearful, we usually feel powerless, whereas anger gives us a false sense of power by sending adrenaline coursing through our body. Although anger may sometimes seem to make us courageous, our behavior when angry seldom remedies the problem and usually makes it worse. Like this story of a woman who killed her partner. But it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, there are other ways. Just get yourself out of there. Get yourself to a safe place, a shelter. So, again, anger is an affliction. So that means it's a wrong consciousness. It's not seeing things correctly. It's seeing things in a distorted way, in a mistaken way, in a wrong way. And it's also an obstacle to liberation, to enlightenment, and also to rebirth in upper realms. If we want to do that, if we want to have good rebirths in future lives, especially in those upper realms, the form and formless realms, anger is an obstacle to that. It's an obstacle to attaining calm abiding, to having peaceful mind and meditation. And it creates lots of problems in our relationships. So many, many faults of anger. So lots of different remedies, tons of remedies, books full of remedies to anger. So would anyone like to share what remedies, what antidotes you find helpful?
I think one of the most long-term effective one for me was realizing it's that whole little series of verses there in Shantideva where the ultimate verse is that anger arises. It simply spontaneously arises through causes and conditions. It is not the fault of the cause of the other person. Nobody intends to get angry. That it is, that it arises and therefore the final verse in that particular translation is therefore when you see a friend or an enemy doing some negative action, say to yourself, such are their conditions, and be at peace. And that such is their conditions, such is their condition. Such is my condition, such is this condition. Actually really helps me with anger to see that it is arising due to causes and conditions. Because one of the reasons I didn't never dealt with this because I had so much shame around it. But that particular way of thinking, that kind of logic, lets go of the shame and embarrassment about having anger. And once that was let go, then it doesn't mean of course I still get angry, but all the layers and layers and layers on top of it are not so present.
Yeah.
So to really look at the conditionality of it, and that for other people's anger too, it gives me a lot more space around accepting other people's affliction.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that really helpful too. Many different causes and conditions giving rise to this. And it's impermanent. It's not permanent. It's not going to last forever. It's just there and then it's gone. Well, sometimes it lasts a while, but yeah, just to know it's impermanent, that's really helpful. And it's not me. It's not the person. It's only a mental state, rising and passing, like a storm. Comes and goes. That's really helpful. Anyone else? Share your favorite, one of your favorite remedies for anger.
One that I have used a lot is just to say to myself, accept the perceived harm. I always throw in the word perceived. Because right away that reminds me that I'm deluded. Because actually, for me, I'm suffering then when I'm angry. And if I'm suffering, I'm deluded. That's one of my mottos. If you're suffering, you're deluded. So that helps me to kind of detach a little bit from the suffering, the perceived harm. So it's disregard the harm, accept the suffering in your mind, and then you use something from the Dharma, which a lot of times I like what Venerable taught us years ago, is who's angry. I can start to kind of just tear things apart and deconstruct things. But to disregard the perceived harm is the first step. To, like, I have to realize I'm creating this. You don't really usually know the other person's intentions or motivations or anything.
The other phrase that I have embedded in my brain, which is also very helpful, is I am not seeing reality correctly. And as soon as if I can get that get that to pop up, and it will come, then that also really slows things down. Okay, you're not seeing reality correctly. Chill out. So you can at least step back and see what's going on.
I think about how miserable it is to be angry.
How what?
How miserable it is to be angry. And I don't want to be angry. I have aspirations to be able to get over being angry at all. So I think, about anger destroys us. It destroys our virtues. It destroys what we're working towards. And often if I'm angry at another being, I try to think about compassion for the other being. And sometimes if someone else I'm responding to anger, with anger, then I kind of like, I'm just doing the same thing. So I think about it that way. I'm acting in the way that I'm have aversion to.
So some responses online, someone talks about going for a walk in the woods. Just being in nature calms her down. And someone else mentions, I find it helpful to think I could die at any moment, and I don't want to die with anger manifest in my mind.
That's very powerful, yeah. And in the Madhyamikavatara of Chantakirti, he goes through the 6 perfections, and so in the section on patience, perfection of patience, one of the things he said that I really liked, he said something like, does anger about something that has been done undo what was done? I'm not saying it very well, but something happened we don't like, it was bad, it was harmful, getting angry about it, does that undo that action? Is that going to change what was done? And I found that really helpful. I mean, it's obvious, it's already done, already over, already gone. Getting angry about it isn't going to help. It's not going to undo that. I mean, that doesn't mean we just be passive. Of course, there are things to do. Like if there's somebody that's been harmed, we can give them help. We can try to take action to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again. But just being angry about something bad that was done, doesn't bring any benefit. So that's quite logical. It's very logical. In a way, anger is illogical. It's not logical. Yeah. So.
It makes it hard to jump from one to the other sometimes.
Yeah. But if we make a habit of using our reasoning, our intelligence, then that part of that muscle, the intelligence muscle, gets stronger, and the anger muscle, which is a bit weak to begin with, is not based on intelligence and reason. So then I think it does help. It still comes up, of course. It still pops up. But, if we're more habituated to using our rational mind, our reasoning mind, our intelligence, then that can quickly knock out the anger.
I can't do this in the moment, but I do think that when I notice that when I'm really cultivating loving kindness regularly as a practice, then it really doesn't arise as much, or there's a lot more space for everybody around it. So that antidote does work as a prophylactic.
Yeah, because if you look at parents, parents with their children that they totally adore, totally love, and the kid can do something really outrageous, and the parent might get angry for a little while, but, they don't stay angry. They love their child so much. So the strength of the love can quickly counteract any anger. So I definitely think that is helpful. More familiarity with compassion, with love, loving kindness, with care, with wanting to benefit others. So if we build up those aspects of our mind, then there's less chance that we would get angry. And if we do get angry, it won't stay very long.
It makes a big difference how you kind of go through your day, actually. At least for me, if you kind of are just getting on automatic and, rushing around, that kind of way of being, then I think it's very easy to get irritable and have it go into anger. So I think for me it's quite important to modulate how I'm moving through the day.
Yeah, because there's that wonderful line in Shantideva, close to the beginning of chapter 6, about an unhappy mind. That's the fuel for anger. So if your mind is already unhappy, discontent, dissatisfied, grouchy, irritated, much more likely to be angry. So if you try to keep your mind happy and positive as much as possible, there's less chance of anger coming out. I found that one really, really helpful. Yeah.
The other thing that I've been working on over the past few years is to own my own afflictive states of mind, but to realize that when somebody else is angry, to not take it so personally. There's something, and by saying that to myself when somebody's angry, then when I get angry, to then not project the cause of my anger being on somebody else. So there's this sort of taking responsibility for my own afflictions and then not taking personally somebody else's afflictions. And for me, that really tempers my reactions to people who are angry. And that also helps me to calm down my anger, because there's no source outside myself except unrealistic expectations, wanting some sort of predictability or some sort of attachment. But it's not personal. When I'm afflicted, I take everything personally. I take everybody's nuances, everything they do personally. And anger in particular. When I'm irritated or upset, I just personalize the whole world as, fueling that discontent, fueling that upset.
You're probably not the only one who does that.
No, but I'm saying I'm identifying that that's one of the main, the main causes on how I watch my mind and how it gets angry. Is that there's that discontent that Venerable Tarpon was talking about, but there's also a lot of unrealistic expectations going on of people not living up to,
Yeah, like
what I
the
think.
stories it mentions in here. Lots of proliferations, conceptualizations, storytelling.
Dramas.
Dramas. Yeah.
Drama queen.
Are there drama kings? I hear this. I hear this term drama queen, but there must be drama kings too, right?
Or drama presidents.
Drama what?
Drama presidents.
Oh yeah. So.
But I'm in the process of training myself in this to channel myself into another direction. So when it's way too much and I don't have the capacity to develop compassion towards the person I have anger with or the situation, then to turn my mind into a direction where now I have passion about. For example, my case, it's environmental.
It's what?
It's the environment. And thinking about future generations, including ourselves. And so then my heart can extend again. And I find some peace and calm and the qualities I actually have within. And then from that power that I have developed, so channeling it into different direction where I actually feel really passionate about, then I can slowly go back to the painful situation and look at it in a different, with a different view.
Otherwise, it becomes like banging your head against the wall. Keep trying to sort out this one problem, this one situation. But yeah, it can be good to go away from that, do something else that's more meaningful and more satisfying, and renew your energy. Then you can always go back to that one later. So maybe we should stop here. It's a good place to stop. Finishing one of the afflictions. So I don't know when we'll have a chance to continue, but there'll probably be some opportunities later on. Lots of other afflictions to go through. But those are two of the biggest ones, the most problematic ones, the ones that keep coming up again and again in our mind and our life. So it's good to be aware of those and work on those as much as we can.